Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the second session of our inaugural VCU Cybersecurity Center and CCI Central Virginia Node Speaker Series. Today, we have a great pleasure of welcoming Dr. Eric Peterson, who will be talking about capturing funding opportunities. Dr. Peterson wears many hats. I grabbed a few photos. He most recently held an office at DOE headquarters in Advanced Manufacturing Office in DC. He also was NSF Program Manager 2006-2007, managing about $50 million budget. He founded several larger institutes. One of these notably is Remade Institute, a national network of manufacturing institutes led by Rochester Institute of Technology, and currently is president of ESP Research. He won a number of awards. He was elevated to INL Laboratory Fellow, won 2 INL Lifetime Achievement Awards, DOE Bright Light Award for the best invention of the past 20 years, holds 25 patents and 99 papers. And he also leads a very exciting life as avid climber, mountaineer, and ski patroller. Actually, on the left-hand side, you can see the photo of Kay's Center for Advanced Energy Studies, and this is how I met Dr. Peterson. One time, he came and asked me about a local patrol, how he can transfer, and little did I know that his office was going to be down the hall, and he'll be one of my directors for years to come. And we enjoyed patrolling together in Idaho, and now I have a great pleasure of welcoming the floor is yours.
Can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So Milos, I need my slides. It went away on me. Thanks, Milos. That's a nice introduction. I appreciate it. I'm looking for my slides, guys. Do I have to share screens again? Yep. There we go. So Milos asked me to talk a little bit about what's some of the opportunities and ways to develop programs and proposals. And so here's some, I want to present some ideas here that we do. I can advance my slides. Am I not in control, Milos?
You should be. Right arrow.
Well, that's not working. Any thoughts? There we go. Maybe it's just slow. So I thought I'd provide a little more information about myself. And I thought there's a theme in this whole thing, basically, that we'll talk a little bit about as we go through. But I want to talk a little bit about learning about R&D funds and sources, talk about a general understanding of DOE and other agencies. I've had a chance to work in most of the agencies in the government, but DOE was my primary sponsor, so I'll spend a lot of time talking about them. You'll find the NIH is not in my lexicon, and that's primarily because, well, I had no contact with NIH, and I had family working there, so I was kind of banned from going that direction. And then we're going to talk about developing some tools for success and how to build strategies. And then we want to talk about, then I want to flip this. I want to flip this talk a little bit and talk about what the perspective of program development is from the university's perspective, or the Office of Research and Development is, as it may be at your institution. And that way you get a different feel for how the PIs, it gives you a different feel of how to think about these things. And then I want to talk about some key components of successful proposals, and then it's your time to grill me. As Milos indicated, I've done a few things. I had some fun. I grew up in a small town of Hamilton, Montana, in western Montana. My family was a medical missionary family. We spent time in Iran and all over Africa. And I came out of high school and went off to college and got a couple of degrees and spent a couple of summers working at a girls' camp as what they call a cowboy. Basically spent my summer on horseback. Then I got the privilege of working with a fellow at the Rocky Mountain Laboratory, which is right next door to where I grew up, doing separations that would lead to some drugs that are currently used as immunoadjuvants and are sold by GlaxoSmithKline. I went off and got my doctorate in Montana State University in Bozeman, did some postdocs at the University of Missouri-Rolla, and then a couple of years at Ames Lab. And then I spent the last 30 years with the Idaho National Laboratory. Just recently retired from there and left, and I've been enjoying a little bit of fun. I spent 2 years with the National Science Foundation in the Engineering Directorate running the separations program. And then I spent a year, just as Milos indicated, right before I retired, at the Advanced Manufacturing Office within DOE. I've done some publishing, raised some funding, and worked all over the place. So the theme I really want to talk about is, how do we learn? How do we develop opportunities? How do we compete those opportunities? And then how do we turn around and repeat those opportunities and make it go, make a real go of it, and turn that into a cycle of constant winning. As we all know, the government is a very complicated place. I've left it fuzzy just to be able to say that it's a very large organization and it's really tough to figure out where things are within it. There are a variety of places we can get funding. Places like DOE, and within DOE there's ARPA-E, the National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA. The Office of Science is a really good fundamental place where a lot of academic funding comes out of. Then there's the folks at Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, and they have a lot of basic science done in them in their area. There's also Fossil Energy, or FE. And then, of course, we look at DOD, the Defense Department, the Environmental Protection Agency, DHS, Homeland Security, and of course, National Science Foundation. And then within the private sector, there's a fair amount of opportunity too, in the sense that people like corporate groups sponsor a lot of work. There are individual groups and or foundations that sponsor research and specifically directed research generally. There are consortia like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and some of the groups they sponsor. And finally, venture capitalists. And so I'm going to end up principally being focused on the Department of Energy, but these principles I present hold for almost every other agency. I want to very briefly talk about how fund sources are distributed in this country. I think we all know this, and that the federal government sponsors a lot of basic research. Business or private sector sponsors some work in basic research, but it's generally pretty directed. Universities sponsor some of their own. And then the other agencies and other foundations I talked about sponsor only about 15 or 20%. But the more applied we go, the more business sponsors. And that's because they have a vested interest. They want it to do something for them to make them some money. And universities typically and federal labs typically get squeezed out the more toward development and commercialization we go. That's kind of the normal trend and has been for years. If we look at where the funding is located, and this is one of the key tenets for this whole conversation we're having today, the funding is located in places like NIH, the National Institute of Health. The Department of Defense is, of course, a major sponsor of research, but a large majority of that it tends to be toward development of specific products that they have interest in. And then the DOE sponsors a good chunk in the area of energy and energy sciences. NASA, National Science Foundation, and USDA all also take part in it at a lesser degree. But you'll find that the Defense Department, the Energy Department, and the NIH tend to be the major sources of large chunks of funding. One of the things you need to think about as you're looking into building a proposal is what type of agency are you working with? And there are generally 4 types. The cabinet level, such as Department of Defense, Department of Labor. Independent ones, such as the National Science Foundation or Central Intelligence Agency, are very specific, and they tend to be able to do a lot more independently than what is required at the cabinet level. There's also commissions like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that fund work, or the Securities Exchange Commission, which also funds some work. There's also corporate types, of which are, I think, 2, one of which is Amtrak. And these agencies tend to have different ways of approaching things. Some are mission driven, which Department of Defense is an obvious mission, defense. And the Energy Department has a very specific mission. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. There's also research driven, such as the National Science Foundation, and within DOE, something called the Office of Science. They are very much driven toward research. DOE does support a bunch of different types of R&D and education activities. So they go over everything from basic through applied and commercialization sorts of things. Plus they offer training and programs to help increase training across the spectrum. However, DOE is a mission agency with a wide spectrum of opportunities within it. And what's really interesting about DOE is that they also have these 17 national laboratories that can be viewed basically as opportunities for field site development and testing of some of the more fundamental things that are discovered at universities. The mission at DOE is to enhance our energy security, something that they've done since the beginning. And one of the things you need to understand within energy, that almost all the funding is based upon energy needs. And this is one of the maps that they draw up every year. The most current one is 2019, and it was not nearly as pretty or colorful as this one, so I chose to keep this one in the deck. We burn, in this country, we burn about 100 quads of energy per year. Quads is a quadrillion British thermal units, which is a lot of energy. It comes from a lot of different sources. We have sources in solar, nuclear, hydro, wind, natural gas, coal, biomass, and of course, lots of petroleum. And what they do in this effort each year is track where we're spending that energy and how we're using it and how much we waste. So you can take it from the left side, take various places that they emphasize, such as the geothermal office or the solar office, and see what drives them to fund work, and how they are funded to conserve energy or how to burn it efficiently. And then they look at how it gets used, and they focus on those sectors such as transportation, industry, commercial areas, and residential areas. And then from that, they begin to parse out how much they're going to fund or spend in each of these major areas. I'm not going to read through the slide, but basically the mission supports things like energy development, science and innovation, and that is a very, very wide range in DOE. They also work on nuclear security and safety, and that's a very broad definition, but the lab I worked at for 30 years focuses on nuclear reactors and energy generation. Other labs focused on nuclear security in terms of weapons and such things like that. And then they have this huge management organization which makes sure everybody behaves and spends their money well. And they also help to develop novel management practices for the government. It's a multidisciplinary, very diverse area, and they do all kinds of different research, from very fundamental biology to very, very highly applied fusion type work. It may be a mission-based agency, but it also does a lot of basic science plus some commercialization. So they have a broad scope. And NIH, DOD, and NSF all have the same broad scope, or very similar broad scopes. And so you really have to understand it, you have to break it down to things that you can understand. I mean, here's energy. Looks a lot like the federal government. And so when I started working with this, I had no clue where to go. I had no clue what to do. It was kind of hard to figure out where you wanted to get funding? Well, you can look at the names and go kind of chase around in them, but you'll never find what you really look for. What I've done here is break it down to figure out where the R&D dollars are kind of hidden. Within DOE, there's a mission. There's this thing called the Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy, which was created, I think, under Obama. And they focus on very innovative, high-risk commercialization of basic science. The non-proliferation area is covered by the National Nuclear Security Administration. They fund a lot of really basic computer-type modeling research. Office of Science is just focused on fundamental research, and they're funded over $1 billion in funding. And then the applied programs such as energy efficiency, Office of Electricity, environmental management, fossil, and nuclear all provide funding in everything from basic through applied, with an emphasis on applied and development and demonstration. Now, with all of that in place, you then have these 17 national laboratories that are focused also on developing a lot of applied work and building other DOE programs. And of course, the national laboratories work across the agencies. Let me cook this down a little differently. You look at the Department of Energy, and the money for research is really hidden within these departments, or these 8 parts of the department. Things like non-proliferation, on the non-proliferation nuclear side, they're hidden over on the left-hand side in those red circles. The research side under the Office of Science, you see Office of Science there, and then the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Environmental Management. And then you can cook it over to things like the Assistant for Secretary of Energy Efficiency, in the the 4th column over. And then you can see fossil energy right under that. These are the major fund sources within the Department of Energy. The rest of it pretty much is focused on other types of applications. So let me summarize it. Beyond that, there are also other sources for things like small businesses, the Small Business Innovation Research area. However, universities can participate in that with companies and do win quite substantial bits of funding out of those areas. The RPE guys have money. Workforce development for scientists and teachers is another area to take a look at. I guess in Virginia's case, you're not an EPSCoR state, so I won't leave I'll leave EPSCoR off the conversation. The Office of Science Policy doesn't have much money, but they offer support toward working with other groups. And so knowing what you want to do and having some international opportunities, you may be able to go in there and have them help you leverage into other parts of the agency. And there's also something called the Energy Innovator Challenge, which is an opportunity for specific small projects to work through developing relatively larger programs. One of the things that we like to talk through a little bit, and is kind of important, is to understand when you're working with these agencies, what's a project, what's a program, what's a center. Projects tend to be very singularly focused, fairly small number of investigators, probably 1. They tend to be 1 or 2 years, maybe 3 at most. They have smaller dollar values, say less than $500,000, and they tend to be pretty limited in scope. So one example in the separations world would be something like separations of chloroform from water. A program is something where you have multiple efforts going on, multiple investigators, so medium-sized teams, up to 5 or 7 investigators. They tend to be 3 to 5 years. Dollar values maybe $1 million to $2 million, maybe 3 occasionally. And they tend to have a broader scope. So something like the development of separation processes for water purification. And then finally, the centers and institutes, the much larger programs, tend to be many projects under one banner. They have multiple investigators, larger teams, anywhere from 20 to 100. They tend to be 5 years or more in duration. Their values are fairly large, anywhere from, I don't know, say 10 million up to 150, 200 million. And they have broader scopes with a title that was something like the Institute for Separation Processes, where there's a bunch of different kinds of processes being investigated in that area. And these things tend to be just some very simple definitions. So as we talk about projects, programs, and centers that people understand what we're going after. I pulled this slide in because I think it helps to explain where these kinds of programs and projects fall. If you look at, and this is what the Advanced Manufacturing Office puts out as what they think their mission is, which is to bridge the gap between basic funding and much more applied funding and commercialization. The innovation hubs, which I'll talk a little bit about, are some fairly large programs, $100 million plus efforts to build and develop capabilities within the country to help protect us and protect markets within the country and help build really good scientific commercial products that we need to protect our markets. The National Science Foundation has their research centers that are pretty basic in nature. And then if you look to that even further to the left for basic projects out of NSF. And then NIST has manufacturing extension partnerships, which really focus on developing technologies and commercializing technologies that are out there. You can see that basically say in that lower part underneath the chart, I show where you take a concept, take the proof of concept, go through lab scale development, and then finally demonstration and scale up follows over in that far right side, and product obviously is in very, very far right side. The point is that there's projects, programs, and centers fit into all parts of this, but primarily centers and programs fit into the middle and right part. I talked a little bit about this previously. I want to suggest there are a number of opportunities beyond a straight program or project to get to grow your technologies. The workforce development for teachers and scientists offers a real good plan for teachers and scientists to utilize resources to educate students on how research is done. The DOE Career Awards are focused. They come out through broad agency announcements, and they're very basic science focused. There's something called a intergovernmental personnel assignment, where a visiting researcher goes to headquarters at DOE or to the National Science Foundation or to the labs and other agencies, and you work with it right in there. You become essentially a Fed, and you learn how they work, what the processes are, and then you go back and you apply that knowledge at home. And that's a very, very valuable experience if you can get one of those. I've had 2 or 3 of them. The DOE laboratory collaborative efforts are put out through funding opportunity announcements or RFPs, and those are a chance to work at national laboratories and learn how they work. There are a number of interagency initiatives which are listed through FOAs and requests for information and annual operating plans. And that's something where you pretty much have to talk to somebody at one of the labs or within the agency. The DOE office within DOE offices, there are specific annual operating plans, and they oftentimes have opportunities for people to join into those areas and work with them. And finally, the M&O contractors, the management and operations contractors, and university outplants are 2 different ways of embedding people in offices. I did one of these in my last stint in DC. Where you actually are working right in the offices, again, as essentially functioning as a Fed, but your laboratory and or your university pays for you to be there, and you just simply work and help the department do what needs to be done. I want to talk a little bit, very little bit, about the budgeting process from the perspective of understanding what's going on within these agencies while you're thinking about what you want to do and get out of it. You got to understand there are realities that are restricting program officers from doing things very quickly or immediately. The federal budget is really a 7-step process that is used throughout the government to build their budgets for the next budget cycle. There's a strategic planning effort. The agencies receive their strategic guidance from the Office of Management and Budget, typically in the March, April, May timeframe. The agencies then submit their budget proposals to the Office of Management and Budget sometime in June, July, August timeframe, and then they negotiate and finalize the budget with OMB with certain arrangements for ongoing programs in the autumn timeframe. The budget typically is released in February, almost regardless of where it's at in this process. There'll be a budget put out there by the president. Many of those budgets in recent times are dead on arrival. They just are not what we expect them to be. And they go through a process called budget resolution, and the Congress comes together with the senior White House area plus the agencies to resolve what the budget's going to look like. Then they write, pass, and conference the final budget in late in July, August. Typically, that goes a little longer nowadays because of political basis. But what's important to understand, there are 7 steps that are constantly going on here. Now let's layer that. Let's think about how these things stack up. So this year, fiscal year 21, we're spending that budget right now that was agreed upon 2.5 years ago. In the fiscal 22 budget, we're currently in the process of writing and passing and getting into conference some of the next budget for 22. And finally, 23's budget is going through the intimate in detail process already. So at any given time, the agencies are working 3 budgets all the time. And there's actually a 4th one layered in there called the Carryover Budget. And that's the budget is carried over from fiscal 20 to 21. So that's why if you're talking to somebody, you're looking a lot of times at anywhere from 1 to 3 years out before much can happen if you're presenting a whole new idea and not just responding to the current set of RFPs or FOAs. I want to talk a little bit about how we succeed at DOE as a principal investigator. And some of these points, most of these points hold for a lot of other areas. I think you need to recognize that most of the other agencies work very similarly to DOE. This is a picture of a market up in Namche Bazaar in Nepal, where it's a place where you take off to do your treks into Everest. It's your last bit of really decent food and really cool markets. One thing that's really important is that you really need to know your research, know it cold. You can't just go into an idea. You need to have a track record of what you're doing and have a pretty good feel of what you're going to do. You need to know your agency, and you need to know your research at the same time. You need to understand your agency's mission, goals, and milestones, and you need to understand how your ideas and concepts really function within the DOE mission and/or the lab mission that you're working with. You need to understand what your milestones are going to be. And then you need to know what your program office's goals, functions, annual reports, and other information tell you about that office. And in doing that, you also need to be able to talk about what kind of research you're doing. Is it basic, is it applied, or is it both? And you also need to know the program managers. It really helps to understand who they are and kind of understand what they have done in their time in that slot. You need to look at their reports, roadmaps, and initiatives they have out, so you can understand how well you can fit within their area. And then you need to get to know those program managers. You can do it by email, you can do it by personal visits, you can do it by a lot of phone calls. There's lots of ways to get to know these people, meet them at meetings. And a lot of them put themselves out at major conferences, and go see them and talk to them. And then what we call in the laboratories and in industry, most of these organizations have what they call relationship managers. And those folks are folks that really work with these agencies very, very closely and intimately. And they develop a personal friendship with the folks at the agencies, and it's an opportunity to really understand, for them to help you understand what those agencies are trying to do and if your work would fit within that area. You might also hear them called government relations offices as well. One thing you really need to figure out is if you're interested in doing applied work, which is things like more focused on energy efficiency and fossil, or are you more focused on basic science, such as the Office of Science? And those in applied work, you'll tend to see things that are performance driven with roadmaps and milestones on them. You'll have technology readiness levels and stage gates and no-goes types of things. You'll set staged. You'll see a set or staged FOA, and they tend to have things like hubs, facilities, and SBIR in them. And one of the terms you'll see used a lot is you'll have program reviews. If you're focused on basic science and Office of Science and some more basic aspects of the applied programs, you'll find that work is fundamental. A lot of these things will be driven, a lot of the requests for proposals are driven by the basic research needs documentation. They'll have rolling broad agency announcements and FOAs to help you get funding. And then there's also things called hubs, facilities and centers there that they sponsor. There's also EPSCoR and so forth. But they're also driven not by program reviews, but by merit reviews. They're looking at the scientific merit of what you're doing. Those are really indicators of what kind of work you're doing and what you're doing with the calls for proposals. In the applied programs, I pulled this directly out of one of the military documents. It gives you kind of a feel what you're looking at for very highly applied programs where, they say the science, technology, development cycle, the basic science is 6.1, 6.2 is down in the lower left part of the slide. And they basically says hobby shop and technology development. Yeah, it's fundamental understanding. Once you reach to the level of making a product, and I've done this multiple times now with the folks at DOD and other major agencies, you start to see things like, oh, there's a feasibility study. They want to understand what your proof of concept is, and then they start getting into technology, manufacturing readiness levels and other stage gate sorts of things. These are the programs when they get really big really quickly because you have to spend a fair amount of cash to get things to happen. If you're doing basic science, like the Office of Science or the National Science Foundation, you need to worry about the merit review. And these things are, I'm not going to go through the slide in detail, but you need to understand your scientific and technical merit of the project. You need to understand what the appropriateness of your proposed method is. And finally, you need, the agencies worry about who they're hiring to do the work. And so you need to really present your team as a very well-functioning, well-oiled organization. And quite frankly, all of the merit review criteria are published in the FOA or the BAA as you're writing your proposal. You need to understand what the current federal initiatives are. Right now, they continue to be things like the material genome. There's in the area of advanced manufacturing. There's the wide band gap effort is still going forward, and they are still funding work. There's additive manufacturing, which is a big deal today. There's jet fuels, artificial jet fuels. There's things like in process intensification, the RAPID program, the smart manufacturing program for doing intelligent manufacturing and making manufacturing a lot more efficient. Remade manufacturing program, which is a recycling program, the cybersecurity manufacturing or SIMANI program. We also talk about things like the energy innovation hubs that are going forward. There's about 4 of them still in existence. There's pilot centers. There's a manufacturing development facility at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And there's also another hub that just came out about a year ago in water desalination. And these hubs have things called spokes that come off of them, where you may have an area of expertise, let's say infiltration, and the water desal guys want to work with you. They'll designate you as a spoke with them, and you would then become a part of their program. And it's ways you need to be pursuing those kinds of things as well. And finally, there's obviously the education component, where there's workforce development training and STEM work that are always going forward. Again, you need to know your program manager. I can't say it enough times. And this focuses on science, fossil, energy efficiency, NSF, all of them. You need to understand what within DOE, there's kind of a club of single investigator groups, the multiple investigator groups, there's EPSCoR there. You also need to understand the energy hubs and centers. And then you also need to be watching the interagency efforts that they put out there, because a lot of those will apply to a university when you don't even expect them to. As you go forward, you'll get to know a lot of different folks, and you'll get to know folks at the labs. And 10 of those labs are focused primarily on basic science. You need to get yourself immersed. And one way to get immersed is to send your CV to Department of Energy headquarters, one of the program managers that you can identify. And you can serve as an external reviewer or panel reviewer. Same with National Science Foundation. You can request to participate in a road mapping or needs exercise. You can take part in all kinds of other small side programs that help build a reputation out there, then they get to know you. Within your institution, you should seek somebody who can help mentor you to understand what these guys are after. And the same thing for applied mentors. I had a mentor that worked with me we're really good friends. We've worked together for 30 years. And after about 10 of them, we kind of went back and forth on how programs work. We got to be very close. He's currently 80 years old and retired, but we've remained very, very good friends. And I cannot help but suggest that you work with people that have assignments from the university to help you understand what goes on in these programs and how to ask them to help you get into some of the programs too. So, you need to understand what your dependencies and resources are. So Virginia Commonwealth, you need to understand the DOE culture, and one way to do that is by immersion. You need to be watching the funding opportunity announcements and understanding what they are and what the contracts and or funding levels are from them. You need to be doing some sales and marketing of your concepts. You need to understand how your budgets are going to align with the federal budgets and the budgets coming into these agencies. And then you need to be building your teaming so that those teams are strong and competitive. And you need to be sure that you have a good, well-oiled working mechanism. And I guess there should be a set of arrows going around the outside there to say you work on the outside as well as on the inside. So when we build programs and projects, there's a lot of different things that happen. And this is kind of a distillation that a couple of us sat down one afternoon and we put together. A lot of folks just get together and go to meetings and meet and greet. Sometimes serendipity happens, and out of that grow workshops. And those workshops can build interest, where you, again, continue to build relationships, you bring more people into these things, and you're always adding and refreshing these sorts of things. And then you start to open discussions between institutions of what you really can do. And finally, or not finally, but from that will result proposals and further understanding of each other. Collaborations start to grow. The university and labs have programs to work together and where you build your capabilities and your infrastructure. Things like university programs, R&D, there's almost every school I know that really competes in the world have some modest amount of funding to help get things going and fund things. Within the laboratories, it's called laboratory development and laboratory development and research, LDRD. Corporate America calls it IR&D, internal research and development. From these relationships grow more proposals, and you really build your partnerships, and you execute those partnerships. You start to win some proposals, you start to get some funding flowing, and you build reputation, recognition. New opportunities tend to flow out of those things, and you go back through the cycle to make it happen. This is kind of a general overview of how this happens. So from a PI perspective, you really need to understand your value add. You need to know your program managers. You need to be able to serve as a review panel manager, be a workshop player, chair a session. Just build your reputation out there. You need to consider working with DOE labs, a variety of ways of doing it. You need to know your relationship managers or your federal relationship people within, and you need to know the people at companies and within the labs elsewhere, as well as the sponsors. You need to send your Office of Science your white papers, meet program managers at meetings, whatever means there is to get to them. And then you need to potentially join some of the advocacy groups that follow what's going on in the government. One's called Washington Right Now, for example. And then you need to use your federal relations office and or your relationship managers to get things to happen at the Washington, D.C. level. And you need to dedicate time, your own time, to understanding the missions, the alignments, and the grantsmanship that takes place here. Here's some references for you. They're out there, they work, they're interesting. So we've talked about learning, we talked a little bit about developing, and now I want to talk about competing. And this is an example of something that was developed at a university to help people where there is very little fuel. This is up in a little village named Dingboche, right at the base of Ama de Blam, a big 6,000 or 8,000 meter peak in the Himalaya, and you can't see it because it's just right there and too big. But it gives you a feeling for some of the kinds of things that help people around the world, and also help to cook things without having to burn fuel. I'm going to flip this now. I'm going to talk a little bit about how this works from the research office's perspective. And this is what we see as being the business program development life cycle. And it's onerous. I'm not going to go through it in detail by any means. It's the subject of entire seminars and workshops. And it isn't perfect because I drew it up. And I apologize, but it communicates what has to happen. And we start talking about how you get a concept all the way into a major program in this effort. And this is focused on something of a $10 to $50 million effort. There are certain steps you have to take, and those steps I'm going to simplify. I'm going to break this down to a very simple map. But this is, as I say, this takes entire days to discuss and go through detail-wise what you have to do in order to win fairly large programs. However, I will make the comment that these same steps take place for every proposal. And they may not take place in major chunks, but you need to check every box in order to have a successful winning proposal. The major steps in this life cycle are things that you do and what happens at the agencies or the sponsor. Things like one has to identify a need or concept. Well, sometimes you can be helping them to identify those needs or concepts and getting them inserted into their strategic plan as well as into your institution's strategic plan. And then you market that concept. That concept you market back to them, and you market it within your institution, and you market it into a team setting. The agency then defines requirements, and you can help them do that, obviously, if you're working with them. But you also have to, at your case, you have to identify what the opportunity for you and your team is going to be. Then, as we go forward, you need to there will be a release. You need to pay attention and see the release of a draft funding announcement. That takes generally a form of what's called a request for proposals or a funding opportunity. And then at that point, depending on what comes out, you can then make a choice as to whether you want to pursue that. And there's a reason that step is in there. Sometimes what you put into the system or work with to get in the system doesn't come out the way you want it to, and you may not be able to compete. For example, one of the concepts I developed within the laboratory system was quite a really exciting opportunity in energy conservation. By the time we got it to the point where it came out as an RFP, the labs were not allowed to compete for that piece of funding. Darn. So that was when we lost. Then what happens is there's an RFP that is released, and you respond to it. And you then go and make that bid decision or decide to write the proposal. You need to validate that bid decision. And at the same time, you're writing, right? The proposal's getting written. The proposals are then submitted. The agencies receive them. They may have an oral defense if it's a large program, and the awards go out. One of the biggest steps I found most valuable, and we all hate, including me, is go back and see why you either won or lost. Of course, when you win, it's great. But when you lose, it really stings. But we go back and spend a day or even 2 days reviewing the proposals and understanding what went wrong. So the real key is from an investigator's point of view and from the perspective of the university is is your unique angle. I show 2 photographs of the same piece of rock and different angles, different ways to look at it, and different ways to focus on what you're going to get out of it and how you're going to win this proposal. Proposal writing and proposal presentation is an art, and it has a lot of different responsibilities, but I've outlined here what the author's primary responsibilities and expectations are. And these things, as I note in the right-hand column, basically, these things can be very small. You may have a program manager that is the PI for a single investigator effort, or for a $150 or $200 million effort, you're going to have a very structured way of doing this, where you have people writing technical volumes, you have people doing management volumes, you have people doing post-performance or past performance volumes, and you have people doing the costing. And then each of the section technical proposal components are written. It all feeds up to the proposal manager with a guy doing capture, worrying about capture, and another doing program management. Each of these things are important in a very large proposal. in a standard single PI proposal, it generally gets cooked down to 1 or 2 people. So it varies depending on what size and how complex the proposal and the team are. However, there are characteristics of every proposal that are important and will cause you to win or lose. Compliance is the biggest one. And quite frankly, I've been working for 30 years at building proposals and teams. And one of the biggest ones, as I keep saying, is compliance. If you have not met what the requirements are within the call, you will not win. And there are no exceptions. If you're responsive, okay, are you responsive clearly to what they're asking for? And does it fit their mission? If you can win, you can lose. Who knows? Strategic focus. Are you following what they call for? Competitive focus. Are you competitive? Are you presenting things that are current? Are you presenting things that are important and are better than other competitive offers? Do you have a plan to follow that? And how do you capture that plan? And is your writing good? Are your images good? And are your pages and your design of pages exciting? All good things to think about, but crucial to winning a proposal. There's a lot of different ways to look at this. There's a lot of folks out there putting out proposals and proposal workshops. There's NSF focused efforts. There's writing proposals for funding opportunities, which is like a PI, single PI to 3 or 4 PI effort. Then there's very specific efforts in terms of things like development and capture. You haven't heard me use the word capture much, but there's a whole art to how do you can write a good proposal and get to the winning point. But if you aren't there with the right backup to hold on to that opportunity and hold on to the quality of that proposal, hold on to what's coming out of the agency in terms of what they need after they decide they want to fund it, you're in trouble. So capture is critical, and it runs throughout the whole life cycle. Then if you're doing DoD work, there's a whole nother set of things that go on there. And so understanding solicitations, bids, and source selection is crucial. And finally, focused on both young and middle career folks developing, leading, and managing technical organizations is really an important set of explorations to take part in. There's a bunch of other areas of interest right now. There's circular economy, what's waste to energy types of stuff. There's recycling of plastics, which is a big deal right now. I don't know quite what your VCU twist might be, but I'm suggesting pelletizing materials, modeling, sorts of things. There's fossil energy's got a bunch of stuff out in the area of rare elements and other opportunities and how to use coal for things other than just its carbon content. There's a lot of opportunities in processing of materials and modeling. I can tell you there's a large collaboration coming up with several different states, of which Alaska is one. And there's going to be a major effort there in the $100 to $300 million effort. There's cybersecurity, which you guys are part of, the Simani effort. There's strategic materials for manufacturing, which is opening up right now. I believe there's going to be a bid there. And of course, there's nuclear energy doing a lot of different things with smaller reactors and much more timely sorts of things. With that, I'd like to open it up for conversation, discussion. It's a long pathway, and it's a challenge to get there. But there's some thoughts. Some may seem kind of random, but there you are. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Eric. Every time I listen to you, I get so many ideas, and then I get a reality check how much more I need to be doing to go forward.
It's tough. It's tough.
This is the time to speak to Eric. Feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead. You can raise a hand or type in your question.
Hi, Eric. It's Irfan from Computer Science Department. So I just want to get an idea, like for you to develop a medium, like $5 to $10 million project. from starting to end, like getting it? How much time do you actually dedicate or invest?
Well, you said 5 to 10 million. When it depends on the need and how well it falls within your expertise and how well you build your team. I mean, I dedicate probably anywhere to get the initial part of it done. If you're just writing it straight up, responding to an RFP, you'll probably spend 100 to 300 hours on it, something like that. Total. Does that help?
Yeah, this is Barbara Boyan. I'm the Dean of Engineering. Hi there. I appreciated your talk because we have a center in another area of engineering that has been quite successful that took 8 years, but your number of 40 to 50 million was spot on. When it was all told, the investment from the university as well as major funding agencies has been about 50 million. So I don't think that you're out of line but you got to start somewhere. And I think Irfan's question is really apropos because we already now have a pretty sizable investment. Saimani is an indicator that the investment was worth it and that we can continue to grow. I think that in the VCU gestalt of how we go about doing things, that we need to understand we've got to do the small stuff to get to the big stuff, and maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
Well, yeah, what I'd say is that you need to be willing. There's a risk that every institution has to take as they do this. As we built one of the $125 million, $150 million efforts, it took us four and a half years to build it, and we knew it's going to happen. It just was required. The international issues out there were causing problems and the markets were getting messed up. And so it took us 4 years of investment at the laboratory level and the university level to put this program together. That was probably, each individual institution was investing about 2.5 to 4 million to win the 125 million effort. I worked on another DoD program where we put out another 30 or 40 million total between the 8 or 9 members, so another 2 or 3 or 4 million per institution to pull the win. And I've been on both sides of the win and lose. It's painful when you lose, and it feels really good when you win. So on the remade thing, we put out, the Idaho Lab itself put out about 3 million to win that one. Hope that helps a little bit.
So Eric, I also wanted to know how your budget looks like, because you talk about $4 to $5 million investment each institute. So where this $4 or $5 million actually being invested or spent, like how the budget looks like? Well,
that's a soft money question, but I'll give a fairly simple answer. You spend money on people writing proposal. You spend money on and I'll say professional. We frankly have a research group that you spend money on them being sure that you're online. You spend money developing the concept with the agencies. You spend money, obviously there's a travel budget in there where you send people out around to market this thing. There's technical presentations you make to establish yourself as a player, or be sure everyone understands you're a player. There's a bunch of different things you do over those 2, 3, 4 years that you take to win one of these big ones. But it's a lot of just people's time putting together legitimate arguments that will convince the agencies that you're the best team.
And this involves engaging right partners at the right time?
Yes. For example, as we built the Saimani effort, I became involved in that in kind of a peripheral manner, but we were looking for, I knew they were looking, and I'd worked with the guy that's the director of that institute. His name is Howard Grimes. I'd worked with him off and on over the years at Idaho and other places. And he was starting to look for good university partners that could do things in AI and data manipulation and data mining. Well, I knew somebody that did that. So Milos came up as a subject, okay, off, here you go. That's, you get to know people and these things come together. And then Milos put a huge amount of effort into selling the capabilities that came from VCU to make sense within the overall picture of the larger institute effort.
And let's say if you lose the proposal, you don't get the funding, and you still, of course, soft money have invested $4 or $5 million. So you think later on, it's still this investment going to be useful to secure any funding later on?
It can be very valuable. An example of one that I was a part of, we lost, is one that was in the area of geoscience. The Idaho Lab put together a very strong team. They had universities and all kinds of folks combined, and we invested a lot in it, probably as much as you just quoted. And 2 years, 3.5 years effort, and we did not win. The University of Utah beat us. However, these fields are not big. We all know that. They're big, but they're not that big, and we all kind of know who's who in these different organizations and different groups and that part of the scientific community. And our fellow that was leading it went down to Utah, had good friends down there, went down, and the laboratory now is getting as much funding out of that institute as they would have as a lead. So it's a matter of how you play the game, but you have to establish yourself and be clearly established and be a clear contender in these things, is what I'd say.
Well, it seems the moral of the story is to decide, be clear on your uniqueness, pursue it, and if you don't win it, keep going on. What you've been telling me for many years.
Keep going, don't stop. It's been my policy. And there are many things I've had that privilege of winning in those areas only because I pursued very hard. And sometimes as you're doing this development effort, things that come out of the blue you had no clue were out there. I give one example in the area of batteries. I was working on developing a polymer membrane for doing a separation in water, and I gave a spiel at a poster at a chemical society meeting. I had a guy come walking by and chat with me for 10 minutes about the stuff, and about a week later, when I got home, I had a call from him, and about 6 months to a year later, the investment was 2 trips to Washington, D.C. to talk to him. I didn't even know a clue where he came from, what he did, never did until I got deep into the program. And all of a sudden, there's about a $10 million per year program crops up, and we're right there running it. So things do happen. There's serendipity in all of this. There's also having a good, strong, well-published, well-characterized program out there that you're doing stuff in, that you're active in, you're one of the experts in the field, you're going to the Gordon conferences, getting invited to the Gordon conferences, you're going to a variety of technical meetings here and there and establishing yourself as somebody in the field. Those are key issues to take part in to make this happen.
So I have a question about the applied funding in DOE.
Sure.
Typically with NSF, you work on panels, you serve, and then you get kind of into the system. In a place like DARPA, you work with a program manager as the program is being built. So in that kind of 2 extremes, where would DOE applied labs lie in terms of building relationships?
You do the same. You need to establish yourself as somebody who does applied work first, okay? And then once you've done that, and that requires publications and patents. And then at the same time, you want to try and be looking where you tie into the lab system. and work with the PIs at the laboratory in that given area of application, and then work with them, help them to drive what's going to come next at those offices. And that you can do it pretty easily.
So your advice is working through the labs is always a better bet in the DOE?
Sometimes it depends on the office. Some offices favor funding labs. Other offices favor funding universities. And even programs and sub-programs within those offices have different objectives and goals. So you need to understand those programs well enough that you know what you're shooting at. If you're going to work with a program that obviously favors one laboratory in the field, you need to be working with that lab. However, there may be sub-programs within those areas that favor universities only. And you need then to have yourself established with them as being one of the players. You can work with the lab and have them recognize you, work with you and recognize you, but you also work directly with headquarters program managers that get to know you. So it's a mixed bag. You have to understand the program well, is what I'm telling you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And this is now a sad moment to end this session. Thank you very much all for attending. Thank you very much, Eric, for coming. We'll move on to executive session now. I would just like to announce next talks coming up. Next week, we'll have John Doyle. I'm hosting CCI seminar series on human factors in cybersecurity. So mark your calendars for the same time next week. Tomorrow, CS department is hosting another exciting talk on cyber physical system security. And please go often to our webpage and look for the updates. We'll have this talk available, the recording, next week, and you can view it on our YouTube channel. Again, thank you very much for attending and have a great day. Thank you, Eric. Thank you,
My
everybody.
pleasure.